Hi, good afternoon. My name's Daniel Crouch from Daniel Crouch Rare Books. And I'll talk to you this afternoon about data visualization in mapping. The image you see there is Earthrise, photograph taken by Bill Anders on the 1968 Apollo 8 mission. And of the 7 billion plus people on Earth that are alive today, and the 100 or so billion that have ever lived, only 3 of them are out of frame on that photograph. And that is really, essentially, the problem of geography that human beings face. And unless and until Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk get their way, it's going to be a problem that we confront for many, many years to come. And that is the inescapable fact that we're prisoners of our own geography. We are intrinsically bound by the physical and the cultural geographies that we encounter in life. And despite however many walls we build or whichever economic blocks we choose to leave, the physical geography will always be there, and the cultural geography is always something we need to bear in mind. As a result, we always tend to define ourselves in terms of geography. And therefore, there is an immediate and visceral appeal to looking at information in terms of space and geography. And so from a very early period in statistics and within cartography, we've been using maps to define facts and to help propagate ideas. And when we discuss facts in terms of geography, there are various issues that arise. So what I'm going to talk about this afternoon is use of data as rhetoric with maps, and how over history people have started to use maps to convince and persuade people of facts, or as they're often called these days, alternative facts. Understanding through geography has a major visceral effect for several reasons. One of those is that human beings like to use their eyesight. We're very persuaded by things that we can see. And maps, obviously of spatial things and things that you look at with your eyes, are particularly persuasive. Paul Samuelson, who's a Nobel Peace Laureate, attributed the phrase to John Maynard Keynes that when the facts change, I change my mind. It would appear that he actually just made the sentence up himself, and Keynes never said it, and you'll discover that quite a few of the statements said about statistics have been misattributed. But that one's a particularly interesting one, because when you're showing information on a map, what you're trying to do is persuade somebody of the veracity of that information. And you encounter 2 problems of cartography, and then several problems of rhetoric. The first problem of cartography is, as I say, the problem of geography, which is the physical bounds of the world. The second one is the problem of cartography, which is that we live in a spherical world, and we're trying to persuade people to see that in terms of a plane when you look at a map. And this is how all map projections appear. And the first decision that any map maker gets when they are constructing a statistical map or any map is what projection you're going to use. There's a very famous meme that you can see online, and I'm sure you've all seen it at some point, which is the true geographic size of Africa. It's a great infographic to show just how ridiculously large Africa is compared with the other countries. And we're most used, those of us brought up in the 20th century and most in the 21st century, are most used to seeing a Mercator's projection, which of course truncates Africa and elongates the poles. But one of the great things about that map that you see everywhere is I could equally well say, well, that's wrong. Because that projection, the first one, is the Winkel-Triple projection, whereas the Moldvede, which is this one here, gives a slightly different angle. You can see my poor old British Isles at the top there, looking rather pathetically small, and then repeated in Madagascar, half the size suddenly. Of course, the other way would be to use a third, like a Gore-Peters projection, which is equal area, and you'd get a different answer again. And so any map is automatically making some decisions about how it's going to display those statistics. In terms of the history of putting statistics on maps, the first time you see a number appear on a map is, as far as I'm aware, the 1540 Munster, which mentions the number of islands in Indonesia. And then you see fairly early on comparative river charts and mountain charts to show which ones are taller and which ones are not. Whether they're correct or not remains to be seen depending on the map. But actually, these are all just raw numbers. Now, human beings, whilst we're very good at using our sight, we're pretty bad at dealing with raw numbers. We're very bad with quantitative information generally. Especially when the numbers get very big, we get very confused. And so what a lot of statistical cartography tries to do, and what we're going to be looking at this afternoon, are attempts to make the quantitative qualitative in a map, and therefore representing statistics graphically. The earliest map to use themes on it, the earliest thematic map, is Jodocus Hondius's Religions of the World. And you can see on here You've got the little crescents for Islamic parts of the world and little crosses for the Christian parts of the world, and then the pagans over here in America with the little arrows. And that's the first attempt, but that's actually not showing numbers. That's not actually showing statistics. It's showing qualitative information only. The first representation of purely statistical data, and I absolutely love this one. This is Florent van Langeren's longitude between Toledo and Rome. And it's really a who's who of 16th century and earlier cartography. You've got Guillaume Jansonius, which is, of course, Blau there, putting in his longitude information. The great Gerrymandering, Schörner, Tycho Brahe, Regiomontanus, Ptolemy, and Magini at the end there, just to name a few. And what this is real data about the declination of the sun and longitude expressed on a line. And so that's the first appearance of visual representation of statistical data. First time it appears on a true map, although that's a cartographic diagram, is the first Isoline map, and that's Edmund Halley's famous map of the Atlantic, showing areas of magnetic declination at the same level. Now, of course, this map he thought it was going to help him identify longitude, but because the magnetic pole moves around, the map is in fact entirely useless for that regard. But it's very pretty, and it is, of course, a very early example of statistical mapping. Isoline maps are used for lots of other things. We see them very familiar now with barometric pressure, for example. However, the most common statistical map, and the one we'll spend a bit more time with, is the choropleth map. And that's where you colour in different sections of the geography according to different criteria. The most famous, perhaps, one of these is William Smith's Map That Changed the World, the first geological map. And it really is a work of unbelievable beauty. It's also a great example of how some of the great cartographers end up rather badly treated by history. Poor old William Smith went bankrupt over this, was shunned by the academic community, imprisoned for debt, turned out of his house, his wife went mad, and his map was almost forgotten for a few years while it was succeeded by his main detractor who basically plagiarized it. So poor old William Smith made this absolutely beautiful map. Now, dealing in maps, I've had a couple of these maps in my time. There's a lovely little reflection of what happens to the history of this, because this is a map of the whole of the British Isles. He also worked on a county atlas that was never completed. And the publisher, Carey, took that county atlas afterwards, obviously in lieu of unpaid bills, and reissued it, but not coloured geologically. So you find this atlas occasionally with like the squares for the geology, but no geological colour. In fact, it's coloured for parliamentary boundaries. And a few years ago, I found at a small book fair a 1933, so 118 years after this map's published, 1933, using the original plates printed on what can only be described as public school toilet paper, and coloured for bicycle routes in the south of England. So sometimes maps have alternative uses that they weren't originally intended for. But this map really, it's almost impossible to overstate the importance of it, because not only did he establish the shape of the strata geological makeup of the British Isles, and therefore by extension the rest of the world, but he also firmly established the fossil records placed within that. Now, that was originally a Danish geologist first mentioned it over 100 years before, but William Smith was smart enough to isolate the individual fossils in the particular rocks, and to realise that if you had a fossil in one type of rock at one period, in one place, you could identify that as a period, and if you encountered the same fossil elsewhere again, that you could also assume it's a similar period of time. And this, of course, is massively influential in the theory of evolution. The use of the choropleth map really is the beginnings of starting to put actual real numbers onto maps. And the greatest exponent of that is a character we're going to see quite a lot of this afternoon, and that's Charles-Joseph Menard. He was at the, in fact, like other people will speak about, he was in fact retired when he started doing his most important work. But he was employed at the École Nationale de Ponts et Chaussées, which is the Bridges and Roads school in France. And this map is not his most famous, but it is the first time you see proportional symbols appearing on a map. And it's a great example of persuasive cartography, because you can really feel that there's an argument here about what's going on. So this is to show the meat imports into Paris from the surrounding regions, with black being beef. You can see the preponderance of the black areas coming from Normandy. The red is veal, obviously up in the Loire, you can see a bit of that. And then the green is mutton. And really that's showing the transport of a good into Paris, and it's explaining why and how those particular regions are getting those into Paris. That's the first use of a pie chart on a map as well. Another map by Menard has been called the best statistical graphic ever drawn. And this is a very famous map, you'll see it everywhere. I was fortunate enough to find one of these last year. What I didn't realize when I found it was actually the second recorded example. But what's great about this map is it shows 6 different types of statistical data in one image, and it's really identifiable. So you can see, starting off over here, you've got Napoleon's army in pink heading out towards Moscow up here, and the return journey in black. So you've got, it's a piece of genius statistics. You've got the size of the force, so it's 430,000 soldiers going out here. That's a big, thick pink line, reducing to some 100,000 by the time they get to Moscow. And the journey back ending up rather pathetically with 10,000 at the end. And you can see why that was a particularly disastrous trip for him. And then, so you've got the direction of travel, you have geographic facts in here, you have rivers and towns marked, but also the temperature for the return journey along the bottom. And you can track the points there with the temperature changes and the change of direction and the changes in the size of the force. And so really, in one statistical graphic, it conveys an enormous amount of information, 6 different sets of data. Menard also was so that's a sort of beginning of a flow diagram. And here's another very famous example of Menard's flow diagram. And this is for the American Civil War. And you can see here, the data is tremendously clear as to what's going on. This is the cotton imports into the UK from America in blue, and from other countries in other colors. So this is, in 1858, the Confederate States are exporting an enormous amount of cotton, and really the main suppliers. And the British government, conscious of this, thinking about alternative supply routes. Now, the Confederate States came up with this idea of cotton diplomacy, which is that they threaten the supply lines to the British Isles and hope that England and Wales will come to Great Britain will come to their aid. But in fact, what happens is the embargo from the Unionists, and they cut down the supply. What does the UK do? Ever the pragmatists and not particularly loyal, we go and get it from elsewhere. So this is coming from Egypt and India in vast numbers. And you can see the cotton from America right in 1864 slows down right to a trickle a couple of years into the war. And then after the war, sure enough, it starts up again, but look what's happened. It never matches its former glory. And there is a beautiful example of really, really clear statistical mapping. And it's showing, persuading you of the truth of the argument that the cotton embargo worked for the Unionists, and the attempt at cotton diplomacy failed miserably for the Confederates. So they'll be, having looked at choropleth maps and then flow diagrams, another one which is almost as famous a map as the Menard is John Snow's on the mode of communication of cholera. Now, every black dot on there marks a death from cholera in the 1854 cholera outbreak in London. And this is all centered around that road in the middle, Broad Street. And some Snow plots on there every fatal case. There were 500 fatal cases in 10 days. That's quite an outbreak. And trying to work out exactly what the causes were. Now, other people beforehand had speculated that waterborne disease, that cholera was a waterborne disease, but this really nailed it, because when he plotted on the wells, he not only found out that there was one particular pump in Broad Street that was the source of it, and it was discovered later it was a contaminated sewer. And they took the handle off the pump, and people stopped dying of cholera. So that's a first epidemiological map, and very, very important. And staying within London, and what's interesting is that we're in the 19th century now, and so the advances in cartography in the years prior to this have given people a faith in mapping. So the fact that maps are accurate and that people are bumping into the cartographic truths, whether it's discoveries of new lands or whether it's in their day-to-day, carrying out their day-to-day business, the fact that something is plotted on a map imbues it with an authority. And so people start to use statistical data based on cartography to prove a point more and more. And a very famous example of that is one of my favorite maps ever made. And this is Charles Booth's map of, it's the first sociological map, and it's the map of poverty in London. Now, there's a lot to say about this. One of the things that's most fascinating is it comes about as a, some people say it was as a result of an after-dinner argument, others as a result of a article in, I forgot which newspaper it was now. in a newspaper, suggesting that a quarter of London lived in abject poverty and half of London lived in near poverty. Booth disagreed, but set out to prove this and got a whole series of volunteers. He was a very wealthy man. He was director of the Booth shipping line and industrialist in Manchester. And it was an article in the Pall Mall Gazette, that was it. And so he set out statisticians to plot where people were in London. It turns out Booth was right. Under 25% just lived in abject poverty, and under 50% lived a relatively modest life, but not far under. And he was really surprised by this. This map was incredibly influential and went on to inspire, for example, Sidney and Beatrix Webb to set up the London School of Economics and a renewal of interest in social class and social mobility. And one of the things that I find fascinating is we're looking at 25% of the population living in the blue and the black areas of the map. That's a very large proportion of the population, but it doesn't take up much space, do they? So the wealthy areas of London so it doesn't show density. The wealthy areas of London, occupied by the rich, are looking like the majority of the map, but they're not. And the choice of colour is quite interesting as well. And you'll see the key. It's not entirely without a value judgment. The lowest class, that black is used for that, described as the lowest class, vicious, semi-criminal. Now, as a statement of economic activity, that's a little bit further than you might do nowadays as a truly impartial statistician. But the map was incredibly influential in many ways, and particularly so in this country. The first sociological map in the US was done for the Whole House project in Chicago. And this is also interesting because it's female cartographers. Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr started the Whole House project, but actually it was Florence Kelly, who was the main map maker behind this. And these show beautiful statistical maps. They show nationality and economic wealth, but also manage to do it by block and at height within the buildings, within the blocks. And so you can see the buildings here have different colours, so they're the ground floor at the front and heading upwards towards it. And it's rather difficult on this graphic to see, but please come and have a look afterwards. I'll show you on the original the different classifications of wealth and the different classifications of use of the buildings and the nationalities. And really this was very influential in dealing with some of the social problems in Chicago in the 19th century. But something that I find absolutely fascinating is a modern version of this. Now this is a map, I don't know if any of you have encountered it. It's called the $1 Million Blocks. Rather incredibly, every one of the coloured blocks on here in Chicago are coloured for areas that spend over $1 million on incarcerating its population in that block. And there are $841 million blocks there. And you'll see the area on the Whole House maps. Obviously, this whole of West Chicago didn't exist back in the 19th century, but that's the area around Whole House. And it's still right up there in the poorest regions in Chicago, which means that some things don't change so much. But it's a very similar map in a very similar area, so it's well worth seeing as a contemporary parallel for the Whole House maps. So we've had a look at some of the different ways one can demonstrate statistics on a map. And the level of persuasiveness of those really depends on the accuracy of the data that goes in and the way it's presented on the map and how believable it is. I also want to talk a little bit about some of the problems that you encounter in doing such a thing. And there are three main problems encountered by cartographic data visualization. One is a sort of problem of tone, I'll call it. One's a problem of scale, and the other's going back to the problem of geography. So, great example of the problem of tone. Remember the Booth maps we had a look at earlier? Well, one of the men who worked on that is a man called George Arkell. And at the turn of the 19th century, there was a very large amount of Jewish immigration into East End of London. And this led to a certain amount of, as may not surprise those of us living in today's climate, a certain amount of racism. And Arkell, probably with relatively noble intent, wanted to plot the extent of Jewish immigration into the East End of London on a map, and did so using the same formula as Booth used for his maps of poverty, and in fact using a similar colour scheme. Now what's interesting here, of course, is the implication that the poorest class, lowest, vicious, semi-criminal, in black on the Booth map, has suddenly become the areas with the highest density of Jewish population in London, which is here. And then the red areas, which were associated with the wealthy areas on the poverty map, are the areas with a very low Jewish population. But the other thing this map does is a problem of scale as well as tone. And that is that the population of the East End of London was never more than about 18% Jewish. And he's marked on here these areas of incredibly high Jewish density, suggesting that there is some great immigration invasion. Now, in fact, this then probably fueled the Aliens Act of 1905, which reduced Jewish immigration into the UK almost to a trickle until we got to the Second World War. And so that in there you've got both the sort of change of tone and the slight implication of negative attitude towards the Jewish population at the time, but also a problem of scale, which is this map is not really showing a proportional influence of the immigration in the area at the time. Talking of problems of scale, and this one, please don't ask me how I found this on the internet and what I was looking for at the time. It's a chart of world penis size. And interestingly, you'll see that there's North America and Europe are relatively similar on here, whereas same map makers following year with slightly different data managed to come up with the proof that not everything is bigger in America. And you'll notice that the British Isles and France are a rather different scale there. And so really the map maker's making a choice about what sort of scale they're going to use, and that's having an influence on how we perceive the map and what it's telling us. And so the statistics on this belie a method and a message that's chosen by the map maker. So the map maker is trying to persuade. The other possible problem encountered is one of geography. And this is going back to what we talked about at the beginning, which is you choose the map, a map maker chooses a map on which to display statistics. So this is a geographic map of the British Isles. Interestingly, on Mercator's projection, so you're still seeing Bristol as west of Edinburgh, whereas in fact that's not true. But you can see this is for the 2010 general election, and you can see what looks like red for the Labour Party being decimated and restricted just a few cities. But when you then look at it in terms of population, this is a rather sort of messy map, you can see it's actually a lot closer than it looks there. And then you express it in terms of parliamentary seats. And I know in America this is certainly a very big deal about proportionality of seats, where the Labour Party there is actually slightly overrepresented in terms of its proportion. So as a cartographer or someone choosing a map, which one of those three do you choose? Well, that's closest to the geographical truth, but again, it's a projection that a decision is being made. That's closest to the demographic truth. You've got the population is adequately expressed. But in terms of looking at the outcome of the election and the effect on parliamentary seats, that's probably the closest to the truth. And so really the idea is that if you want to express an idea persuasively and convincingly for a particular subject, sometimes you need to abandon some topographical truth in order to get to the heart of the matter of the data that you're dealing with. And the paradigm case of that is one of my favorite graphic works of all time. I'm very familiar, Harry Beck's map of the London tube system. Intriguingly, Beck, much like Menard, had in fact retired by the time he made this map, or rather, he had been retired. Went home, drew this, and they said, well, you better come back to work then. Map that's endured, this is done to 1933, and it's still functional today on much recognizable terms. So, if we're looking at persuading people and explaining truth in terms of abandoning the topography of a map, you can then start to do all sorts of interesting things, some of which are more successful than others. This is a map of bilateral migration between the different countries around. So it's a geographical map, a geographic diagram. It talks about geography. So you've got North America up here, and that's North America emigrating to Europe, and then a very small trickle from Europe back to North America. And you can see Latin America, a very large amount going to Europe, and even greater amount going to... But I would argue it's not a very successful map. It's confusing, and it's abandoned to geographical truth, so you don't really recognize it, in order to show something very complicated, and I'm not sure it's succeeding so well. Whereas on a similar attempt at completely abandoning the geography underlying the map, we have this, which I think is a rather embarrassing map for those of us who live in Western Europe and North America. This is the current Syrian migration crisis. You see, that's the total population of Syria pre-war. You see, by far the majority of the displaced individuals actually stayed in Syria. People don't like to move much. They prefer to stay where they are. And then the neighboring countries obviously taking on very, very large numbers of immigrants. And Germany and Sweden can hold their head up a little bit high, but really the rest of Western Europe and North America taking on what can only be described as a rather small number. And yet, think about all the fuss that was made about it. As a proportion of the problem, it's minuscule. And my own country, somewhere up here, took on 4,600 immigrants. That's not even 10 Boeings. So Compare that with the response of America and Western Europe during the Second World War, and you can see there's a rather telling statistic revealed in that. So that's a rather persuasive use of an infographic. And we can come full circle because one of the most interesting things that look at maps is sometimes they tell us what we're not expecting to see when you compare two maps in correlation. And this was pointed out to me by Henry Dolliver, who's here in the room, the other day. And this is a map of slave ownership in 1865 in the US, compared with county-wide election returns in the presidential election of 2008. And that is, as the statistician John Tukey says, the greatest value of a picture is when it forces us to recognize what we never expected to see. You wouldn't have thought 150 years later you'd be looking at the reflection of slave ownership in the 19th century in a presidential election. But whilst correlation doesn't prove cause and effect, it certainly is a very interesting and revealing graphic and suggests that there might be some relation between the two. But before you get too carried away about such things, here's another graphic that I dug up from the dark recesses of the internet. And this is the leave the EU referendum in the UK correlated with the outbreaks of mad cow disease in 1992. Whilst I would love this to be a true story, unfortunately it's a classic example of fake news and someone's just made that up. And it's an object lesson in when you look at the map, however clear the fact may be, you need to check about where the numbers are coming from that are influencing it in the first place. And with that as a final thought, you need to be aware about not only how the map is expressed geographically, but also the people who are making it and what their intentions are when they do. And I hope that's given a broad overview of the different methods that have been employed historically for demonstrating numerical statistics in a qualitative manner on a map. And if any of you have any questions, I'll be happy to take them.
Can you tell us a little bit about your story and how you got interested in this?
Well, actually, I've always been interested in statistical mapping. I come from a family of social scientists, so that might influence that. But actually, this particular project, we've recently, for those of you who don't know, we've recently issued a catalogue full of statistical maps, landed on my lap without me even really trying, which was I bought the William Smith geological map, and I bought some of the Menard collection. And I started thinking, maybe I could do something with this in terms of data visualization. And then things just started falling out the sky. And we put together what was basically a who's who of the great persuasive maps or thematic maps. Without really being that clever about it, it just sort of happened. And I don't think I could do it again. But things like there's a nice little story about the cholera map, which is I had sold one previously. And so I phoned up the customer to say, I know I sold one of these, may I use it? I know you don't want to sell it, but may I use it in the catalogue? And he said, actually, I was thinking about selling it. And so it sort of happened that way. But I do think that having been interested in cartography for a long time, these are some of the most interesting aspects of maps, especially in the sort of later modern period. And it's the one that fascinates me. But to some extent, all maps, of course, are data visualization tools because you've taken the projection of the map in the first place and you're choosing what to put on it. I remember somebody asked me once in an interview, do maps change anymore recently these days? And I was stunned for a bit thinking what's changed on maps. And I suddenly realized I'd been walking the week before and I noticed an excellent change, which is that the Ordnance Survey have changed the signal for public house, which was a PH for a pub, and they've changed it to a pint of beer. Much more understandable and much more recognizable. So some things do. And so different graphics can be used on maps in different ways. Anyone else?
Question. I'm curious, when you look back at the history of these maps, and you've seen quite a bit of them, do you see any fluctuation in the sort of adherence to objective truth in the data itself change over time? Do you see any patterns in the way that, I don't know, were there always maps like this here where you have, maybe bad faith arguments being made? Or did that change over time in any way, in the way that we think about statistics and data and cartography?
I think certainly people have got much better at bending the facts towards their argument. And that seems to increasing almost logarithmically as time goes on. People are much more savvy now about clearer graphics. And there's been a lot of work since the 1960s on clearing up and tidying up infographics to make them more straightforward and more plausible. The underlying data behind that, and there's a really big philosophical question here, which is that if I'm taking all the data that I've picked up and really stripping it down to make it qualitatively in a small number of data sets, I'm taking away some of the scientific method here, which is to be able to drill back down into that data. So it's only, I can show a chart showing a correlation between Remain and Leave voting and BSA. It's only when you start looking at where did I get my numbers from and you realize I haven't got any numbers that really you've got the scientific method impinging. And so, one needs a critical eye when looking at the map. And certainly if you look to the 19th century, I've just had a thought about this one, you can see sort of the eugenics movement and people are arguing for racial superiority can use cartography to demonstrate some of those points, and I would say that's deeply suspect. But yeah, certainly there are also different ways of looking at different sets of statistics underneath, and I think over time people are getting more sophisticated at confusing us with that, perhaps.
So this space of data visualization is more technological, it's newer, the whole map world is different, right? I mean, I guess can you talk a little bit about the space of the map space and the antique map kind of mindset, and is this idea, the things that you're talking about here, growing in importance in the map world?
Well, that's why I'm here. Is definitely yes. Is the short answer. People have, especially with the advent of the internet, data visualization has become really big news. And obviously people talk about data being the new oil, is an expression you hear from time to time, and mining that data and being able to make conclusions from the information that you get with this sort of great agglomerating tool of the internet is what so much of modern commerce is about. And companies like Facebook and Amazon absolutely living off the information we give them that it can be mapped as data. And a lot of that is geographic. And so I think there's a lot of people working in that space suddenly find the work in the 19th century much more interesting than perhaps we would have done 40, 50 years ago. And I'm seeing that in my business, in that there's a bit more of demand for that sort of maps and much more interest. It's really lovely being here and seeing so many young people interested in exactly this type of mapping rather than ye olde maps showing here be dragons and a few sailing ships. Although there's nothing wrong with those maps either. And it's fascinating to see that not just regeneration in the statistical side, but there is another, the thematic maps have another side. I've concentrated mostly on those that are born from numbers, but actually persuasive cartography, which can be, and there's a whole stream of caricature maps expressing countries as personifications of either animals or caricatures of their attributes. That are meant to be a little earworm and get into your brain and give you an idea in a particular direction. And persuasive cartography as a field is absolutely fascinating, and it obviously ties in with advertising and polling and all sorts of other fields.
I want to pile on the last one. This is super exciting. Thanks, guys. Trying to rebuild the argument that he was getting at in terms of trust and the fake news. You said something earlier when you were looking at the color map that jumped out at me around, by virtue of it having been plotted on a map, it was more trustworthy.
Yeah.
And so sort of jumping on that, your last comment, is there a disintegration in trust on the experience side? Rather than, we understand that cartographers have been trying to persuade forever, here be dragons and there be Greenland and things like this. But in terms of the just baseline trust in the accuracy of the map, is there, do you think, a disintegration in the expectation of accuracy?
I think people have lost a lot of faith in statistics. I mean, the title of the talk is, going back to our misquoted quotations, it's meant to be attributed to Benjamin Disraeli, that there's 3 types of lies. There's lies, damn lies, and statistics. In fact, that was probably said by Mark Twain, and Mark Twain alone attributing it to Benjamin Disraeli. So there's always been a certain skepticism, that's going back into the 19th century, certain skepticism about where the data comes from, what someone's trying to do with it. I think people have become much more sophisticated. I mean, one of the tools that you see most often, and you'll see this on your nightly news, is dropping off the proportion on the bottom of a graph. This is not a cartographic one, but taking away the proportionality of a graph. So you see, spiraling inflation, or you see a huge stock market crash, and actually, it's just somebody using that particular bit of data to try and make their point. Whereas really it's kind of there's a movement, but it's not a statistically significant one or a particularly profound one. And so we get people playing with the numbers. And I think we've become, because there's so much bad faith in doing that, and we've become inured to not trusting what someone says. I mean, there's a politician, a particularly odious politician in the UK called Michael Gove, who during the EU referendum, going back to this map, said, well, we've all had about enough of experts, haven't we? And this idea that you've lost faith in the people who are actually providing you with the original underlying data and then interpreting it.
So I want to couple that comment on faith and the disintegration of that with your comment on the future of cartography, which is to say we all have the maps in our phones that are all giving us everything we want, right? We all know what the traffic data is and are compiling it from 15 different sources, and we can tell what the weather, So there's a disintegration in trust in cartography and also an increasing dependence on it too.
That's a lovely little, absolutely, that's a really, really interesting, I'm not sure there's a disintegration of trust in cartography though. I think there is an issue with trust in cartography in some fields. For example, those of you in the room work for Google Maps, I'm sure you're aware that there are great swathes of China that you can't see on Google Maps, and I believe Dick Cheney's house is quite hard to track down. But I think generally speaking, we bump up against the sort of hard and knobbly realities of cartography. You can go there and see whether it's like they say it is on the map. And if you go into the room outside here, you'll see some of the really early maps suggesting that California is an island, or that there's the big northwest and northeast passages. Korea is a
mad cow disease to the moving.
Exactly. So I think cartographic truth is something you can walk into. I think how that truth is then used to express another point is much more interesting. And I think one of the reasons we have faith in statistical expressions on maps is because we do know we can trust the map ultimately by going there and having a look at it. The question about where we get the statistics we put on there and how we use them is of course the one where people are breaking down. Hi, yeah.
So do you think the evolution of digital maps is a good or a bad thing, or how, if either way, how would you like it to proceed?
I'm not sure that's a question I can answer. I'm not a digital cartographer. I have little to do with it.
Seeing information on maps, like what's the good and the bad out of this digital evolution?
I think what's fascinating for me, having worked with maps for best part of 30 years, is how much more interest there is in cartography than when I was a younger dealer. Now, I think someone alluded to earlier, we see maps far more often in a day. We see many more maps. If you think how many maps you see in a day now, every time you book a restaurant, every time you book your Uber, every time you try and go anywhere, you actually see a little map on your phone or on your laptop that tells you where you're going. Compare that with 20 years ago, where you'd maybe get the A to Z out every now and again. So we're much more familiar with cartography. And a fact that I absolutely love is that the maps we look at now on a GPS or on our phone have more stylistically in common with John Ogilby's 1672 strip maps, which is the first road map atlas, than they do with the AA we have, the Automobile Association in the UK, or the RAC maps, because they show that you see the cartography in your direction of travel, and the only points that are on there are the ones that matter for your journey. And that's a really lovely little reflection between sort of 17th century and 21st century cartography. And I think that has generated a much greater interest in rare maps and antique maps, which is great. I love that. In terms of digital mapping, somebody here actually told me that there's a fascinating set of parallels between how we're mapping the world now for automatic car navigation, and that traditionally we've used, since going back to Ptolemaic times, celestial navigation, which is you take the fixed points and the stars above us to determine GPS coordinates, as it were, here on Earth. It's a particularly relevant point for the UK because we're about to get kicked out of the Galileo program to make our own GPS for Europe, which leaves the question, what are we going to do when we leave the EU in terms of celestial navigation? And then someone the other day here said to me, well, actually, an alternative format for navigation for cars is to use the underlying geology. So going back to William Smith's map here, and actually to use absolutely immovable underlying geology to the area where the cars are going. And that's fascinating to me that we've gone back to discussions that were happening in the 16th century between whether you use celestial or terrestrial navigation to work out how a map's put together. I think that's great. So I think in terms of where digital mapping is going, that's a really profound difference because you've got a sea change there. If you are going to start using underlying geology rather than celestial cartography, the origin of the map is completely different. I hope that answers the question a little bit. Hi, yeah.
Earlier you showed a map that you said was extensively copied and the map maker went bankrupt. Did copyright emerge for maps at the same time as copyright protection for text, or did it lag the copyright protection for novels?
Well, it's actually a very interesting point. In fact, in many respects, the notion of copyright, not actually legally defined, my wife who's a lawyer would kill me for saying it was illegal copyright here, but the idea of copying maps was hugely important and valuable going back into the 15th century, and something that I discussed with a colleague the other day, the name Mercator as in Mercator's projection, and the word merchant both have as their etymology mare for sea and chart, so sea chart. And in fact, the Portuguese and Spanish empires in the late 15th and 16th century had as a rule on pain of death that any merchant traveller leaving port had to take with them the most up-to-date maps available, and the Casa de las Indias, both in Portugal and in Spain, would hand these out to the ship pilots, and when they came back, they had to add their amendations on, which were then added onto the master map. And these master maps were updated, and even with the advent of printing, the Portuguese and the Spanish did not get involved in printed sea charts. They kept them in manuscript, and they handed them back because this was it's an economic secret. This is extremely commercially valuable information. And it was when the Dutch, in one particular book, Lidschotten's Itinerario, when the Dutch got hold of a whole pile of these sea charts and published them, suddenly this material was available to a much greater audience, and the notion of the privilege to do this then got enshrined in law in the States General in the Netherlands, and you would have to get the privilege to publish, a permission of the state to publish a state secret or a map. And so the notion of cartographic privilege, which is not quite the same as copyright, but it's a permission. And then you get into in the 17th century in the UK, you get these wonderful legends on the sides of maps, particularly Herman Moll, who was a great plagiarist himself, but he was the first to accuse anybody else. And you see on the side of his map saying, this is the new and accurate map and not at all like this terrible one by whoever it is. And so you see there that there's a sort of the notion of copyright defending my own ideas. And you see quite often there's a wonderful Dublin publisher by the name of George Grierson, who's wholesale ripped off Moll's maps, even as far as a little note saying, this is not a true copy. So, I think that's the notion of copyright really, I think when it's actually trying to law, it applies to maps equally with text. But I'll need to check that one. Yes? Oh, sorry, I can't see because of the light.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I'm curious about how the amount of data, especially identity data, that we're able to plot on maps is playing into upcoming cases of gerrymandering. When you talk about the way that people can reframe this data to potentially manipulate or persuade people about something that's not necessarily true, do you think we're headed in a more or less just direction as we get more and more of that data?
It depends on which part of the world you're in. Actually, different countries have different schemes for dealing with it. I know that in the US, level of gerrymandering. I've seen some constituency maps here which are just mad, and it applies to both sides. We've just undergoing this in the UK at the moment, which is that the government are trying to enforce the current parliamentary boundaries favour areas that have traditionally voted for the Labour Party in the past, and there was in fact a move that was meant to go through in this Parliament to reduce the number of seats in the House of Commons by 50, which would have favoured the sitting government. However, given the rather fragile parliamentary democracy that's happening in the UK at the moment, this hasn't happened, A, because they haven't got the legislative time for it, but B, some of the old political boundaries are breaking down and the government aren't sure what's going to happen with their friendly MPs in this situation. So that's an example of where it's being heavily politicised and just pushed to one side at the same time. The methods for doing this, there's enormous amounts of material written about this. I've dabbled in it just for fun, but there are books written on that subject. I think that there is no country that I know of that has got a system I think looks particularly fair. And I think that people don't do enough to address it. There's never, there seems never to be the political will, because the party in power has always just benefited from the system that's elected them. There was a very interesting case of this, again, sorry to talk about the UK, but it's what I know about. In the 1997 election, when Tony Blair won with a massive landslide, he had been talking the week before the parliamentary elections about working with the Liberal Democrats and bringing in proportional representation, and then majority of 180, who cares? Project abandoned. And I think that similar things apply here as well. Any other questions? Well, I think, unless I can, I think we're done.